Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 310, The Death of Charles IX. On April 19, 1572, England and France signed the Treaty of Blois. This treaty, executed without any marriage promises, bound England and France to provide military and naval support to each other against their common enemies. These included Spain and the Protestant countries of the Netherlands, though Elizabeth continued sending secret military aid to the latter. The treaty also meant the end of French support for Mary Stuart. Catherine de' Medici, however, continued to press Elizabeth to marry. She feared, with the door shut on French support, the Scottish Queen would simply reach out to Spain. Elizabeth, however, continued to be non-committal. She was both uninterested in a marriage and didn't really trust France, at least not completely. Elizabeth knew that Catherine had sought a Spanish military alliance before turning to England as a second, decidedly backup option. What might happen, Elizabeth wondered, should Philip II of Spain die and Spanish attitudes toward France soften? It was a fair question. On September the 3rd, the Queen was out on progress and still considering a marriage alliance with France when disastrous news reached her. She, reportedly, immediately ended the dance she was observing and sent all of her courtiers home. The news Elizabeth got was, of course, the news of St. Bartholomew Day Massacre, which had taken place on August the 24th. Her reaction was not the same as other monarchs. King Philip, hearing the news in the privacy of his bedchamber, danced for joy. Mary Stuart stayed up all night celebrating, while the Pope expressed his satisfaction at the annihilation of so many heretics. But the massacre of St. Bartholomew, as it became known, profoundly shocked Protestants all throughout Europe and provoked an outcry against the French government and Catholics in general. Huguenot refugees who had fled to England brought with them dreadful tales of atrocities, of rivers of blood in the streets and streams choked with bodies. Despite her outrage and horror at the events, Elizabeth knew she could not react. She needed her French alliance too badly. Without it, England would be dangerously exposed once more. Still, when a French ambassador approached her 2 days later to explain the massacre, which he termed a quote-unquote accident, and discuss further marriage proposals, Elizabeth told him the latter was now firmly out of the question. Not surprisingly, the massacre of St. Bartholomew had provoked more cries for Mary's head from those of Elizabeth's subjects who saw it as part of a grand Catholic plot. Elizabeth, though, didn't want to provoke Philip or the Pope by executing Mary herself. So on the 10th of September, on her direct instructions, her counselors secretly requested the Earl of Mar to demand Mary's return to Scotland and there to try her for the murder of Lord Darnley, a trial that would almost certainly end in Mary's execution. The Earl of Mar, however, would only agree if English soldiers were present at the scaffold, and since this would implicate Elizabeth in Mary's death, the Queen was obliged to abandon the idea. Now, things got a little bit better in July 1573, when Charles IX announced a measure of religious toleration for his Protestant subjects. This was a prudent policy in and of itself. However, it was almost certainly undertaken with the goal of securing that elusive marriage alliance with England. But it made no difference. Elizabeth still refused to marry Catherine de' Medici's youngest son unless he agreed to come to England and take no offense if Elizabeth rejected him. Clearly, the English queen knew there was no way the proud duke would agree to those conditions. It was, in effect, a pocket veto. Frankly, Elizabeth was getting too old for Tudor times, honestly, to consider marriage and children anyway. That September, she turned 40. Henry VIII, her father, had only lived to 55. so by the standards of the day, it seemed likely that the Queen had lived most of her life by 1573. In December of that year, Walsingham replaced Cecil as the Chief Secretary of State. This was a massively important development. He would focus his efforts on foreign affairs, and in particular, in the development of a spy network that would become the best in all of Europe. That network had two goals: protect the Queen and find the evidence necessary to bring Mary Stuart to justice. Meanwhile, back in France, Charles IX was still reeling from St. Bartholomew's Day. For 3 days after the events, the royal family did not dare to leave the confines of the Louvre Palace. Coligny's body was cut to pieces by an angry mob and tossed into the Seine, where portions were later fished out to be displayed. According to one report, Catherine had the head embalmed and sent as a sort of trophy to the Pope. Now, Catherine had no remorse for the situation. Her only driving ambition was how to keep her son on the throne in light of all the chaos. The fact that what was supposed to have been a limited culling of important Protestants on a list drawn up and signed by the king devolved into a bloodletting that resulted in the deaths of upward of 30,000 people illustrates just how little authority Charles actually had. In Paris alone, 2,000 to 3,000 people died, but only 800 Huguenots were registered in the capital, affirming the contention that all this was about a lot more than merely religion. Interestingly enough, the Duke of Guise was appalled by the carnage and sought to distance himself from the massacre, just as Catherine tried to pin everything firmly on him. He made a public declaration that the death of Coligny had restored his family's honor, and that was all he had ever sought. The rest, he said, was all the work of lawless thugs. On Tuesday, the 26th of August, before having regained proper control of the city, Charles held a special lit de justice, it's like a little court, attended by his brothers and Henri of Navarre. At this hearing, he carefully listed the outrages and crimes committed by Coligny and his rebels against both him and the crown over recent years. He also outlined the number of concessions he had made to the Huguenots. And in return for all his goodness, patience, and generosity, he claimed that the admiral and his cohorts had plotted to kill him and his family. He added that the Duke of Guise had acted solely with his royal authority. And finally, he made the final declaration, quote, "I wish it to be known that the severe executions of the past few days have been performed by my express command in order to prevent the results of this abominable conspiracy," end quote. When asked if the king wished his words to be entered to the records of Parliament, he simply replied, "I wish it." The parliamentarians then proceeded to just heap praise upon the king for his magnificent defense of the throne against these horrible rebels. But in reality, all they were doing was writing up a formal written excuse that would protect them all in the future. For as you see, everyone present was complicit in some way, shape, or form. France required an official explanation for the massacre, and now Charles had given it one. Not that that mattered. Even Catherine knew that the real casualty of the events of that August had been the monarchy and herself. Every Huguenot in France now hated her son with the passion of 1,000 sons, and her even more. To them, the entire wedding appeared like nothing more than a Machiavellian ruse. It had been a carefully laid trap designed to get all the important Huguenots of France in one place where they could be easily exterminated. How, all these people asked, could they still be loyal to a monarch that wanted them all dead? Abroad, the news hit the different courts of Europe, as I discussed, to disparate reactions. Philip II, according to one source, actually did a little jig, beaming the whole time. The Pope was ecstatic. But not everyone, of course, was happy. The Holy Roman Emperor refused to peddle the story that this had been some sort of preemptive strike to take down a Huguenot plot. He told his kingdom that it had been a massacre, plain and simple. The Venetians, who were business-oriented likewise, were appalled. And of course, throughout the Protestant courts of Europe, the reaction was only one of disgust, though, as we know, Elizabeth was willing ultimately to let the incident pass for political reasons. She could not afford to alienate the Catholic superpowers of Europe for a cause she ultimately determined was not England's to fight. The German Lutheran princes and the Swiss Calvinists were aghast, despite Catherine's claims that the murders had only been carried out because of Coligny's plot and not because of his faith, an excuse that absolutely no one bought. Even in distant Russia, Tsar Ivan IV decried France for its barbarism. I do have to say, that's a pretty hilarious comment coming from the man who is known to history as the Terrible. Now, if you recall, not every Protestant noble in the Louvre had been murdered. Condé and Henri of Navarre, who's having a terrible honeymoon, by the way, are both still alive. But they must have realized that they were only safe so long as Catherine deemed it necessary to keep them around. She was desperate to see both men convert to Catholicism. Charles had promised to keep them both safe back on August the 24th, but Condé, still loudly and rather foolishly, insisted he would seek vengeance for the massacre. For the moment, that wasn't an option. So it was that on September the 29th, in the Notre Dame Cathedral, and in front of as many witnesses as the Queen Mother could summon, both men were received back into the Roman Catholic Church. For his part, Henri was determined to survive. His friends' killers became his closest companions. He was agreeable at court. He betrayed no emotion at all, or sense of being wronged. In other words, he put on a mask, and he wore it well. By the end of October, the quote-unquote season of St. Bartholomew was finally over. Catherine believed that time had been turned back and that the old status quo would dominate once more. She was wrong. What Catherine failed to grasp was the irreparable harm St. Bartholomew's did to her reputation and that of the French monarchy. No one was ever going to forget what happened. So long as Catherine lived and had a role in the government, the French monarchy simply was not to be trusted. In fact, Charles's reign was so dominated by his mother due to his age and health that he is remembered almost exclusively for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Nor did the massacre, frankly, even work. New Huguenot leaders emerged almost before the blood on the pavement had dried. Whipped up by their pastors, the Protestants became more zealous than ever. In southern France, areas of strong Huguenot control such as Nimes, Montauban, Privas, and Sancerre locked their gates and prepared to defend themselves against further Catholic aggression. Most troublesome of all remained the port of La Rochelle on the western shores of France. The citizens, who had raised a force of about 1,500 men, defied the regime when, not long after St. Bartholomew, Marshal Biron, a moderate Catholic who had saved many Protestants, honestly, during the massacre, arrived at La Rochelle to take over as governor. But immediately, the inhabitants denied him entry to the town. The Rochelians sought the aid of Elizabeth of England, as we know, calling her, quote, their natural sovereign princess for all eternity, end quote. In November 1572, Charles and Catherine were determined that this Huguenot bastion be retaken, and ordered Biron to lay siege to the city. La Rochelle boasted over 50 pastors, who told all the citizens, including women, to mount the strongest defense possible. Anjou, who did not arrive to take up his command against the city until early 1573, led a strangely mixed army whose commanders were almost constantly at odds with each other. Anjou led a motley crew of reconverted Catholics, a few loyal Protestants, and rival feudal lords. But La Rochelle was determined to resist this royal entourage. Women manned the battlements with their husbands, hurling down stones and other makeshift projectiles onto the attacking royalists. Time and time again, the royalist army was repulsed. Anjou would, in fact, never actually take the city of La Rochelle. On May 11th, 1573, after protracted negotiations and loads of promises of French money and military aid, he was elected the King of Poland. Anjou received the news on May 29th. It gave him and the crown the excuse he needed to end the siege quickly and reach an agreement. The two sides reached a deal called the Edict of Boulogne. In it, Protestants got some legal protections for their faith. They could not be prosecuted just for being Protestants. Moreover, they would be allowed to openly practice their faith in 3 cities, La Rochelle, of course, Nimes, and Montauban. The next several weeks were taken up with all the pomp and circumstance of Anjou's election as the Polish king. But amidst all the revelry, a dark cloud was forming. King Charles was visibly dying. Upon returning from La Rochelle, Anjou saw his older brother and immediately remarked, quote, "He is dead." Catherine, for her part, promised her son she would not allow anyone to usurp the French crown in the event Charles did, in fact, pass away. That being said, all of Catherine's younger children were already actively plotting against the Duke of Anjou. On August the 22nd, 1573, about a year after St. Bartholomew's, Catherine arranged to have her children and other important members of the court swear an oath that should Charles pass, Henri, Duke of Anjou, would be the King of France. And all this came not a moment too soon. In October, Charles fell desperately ill. While his physicians believed that this was a rare form of smallpox, modern historians agree he was suffering through the final stages of tuberculosis. He lay sweating, covered in blood that seemed to seep from his very pores. The sight of his brothers around his bed, hovering like buzzards, seemingly gave the dying king one last rally. He sat up and ordered his brothers' immediate departure, both from the room and from the kingdom. Catherine consented, but not before staging a truly bizarre and not at all genuine final goodbye for her 3 sons. It was not until December the 2nd that Henri, Duke of Anjou, finally left France for Poland. Now, while all this was going on, things hadn't gotten any better in the kingdom. Catholic generals felt perilously exposed and saw assassins around every turn. The Duke of Guise himself was the target of an attempted assassination in February 1574. Neither were the Protestants being shy about their feelings. A steady stream of pamphlets flowed from Calvinist Switzerland, decrying the present state of the French monarchy. The writers denounced the absolutism of the present monarchy, arguing the position was always meant to be elected. And of course, they argued fiercely against rule by women, i.e. Catherine de' Medici. These pamphlets found fertile ground in a France desperate for reform. In fact, there are some historians who claim that the ideas and complaints that would drive the French Revolution came into being during the mid-16th century. Meanwhile, Charles's health had taken another turn for the worse, and so had his mood. The Venetian ambassador wrote, quote, "He never looks one in the face when one addresses him. He stoops as his father used to do and contracts his shoulders, and he has a habit of lowering his head and narrowing his eyes. Then he will raise them abruptly, and as if with an effort, and gaze overhead or drop them again, hardly glancing at the person to whom he is speaking. Besides being morose and taciturn, they say that he is also vindictive and never forgives anyone who offends him. It is feared that from merely being severe, he will become cruel. For some time past, all his thoughts have been of war, and he has nothing else in mind, being naturally inclined to it, and his mother will have the greatest difficulty in restraining him. He wishes to conduct it in person, being bold and courageous, and it is for this purpose that he gives himself unremittingly to exercise and labor of every sort, to harden himself and to be fit to endure the hardships of war." End quote. Relations between Charles and his mother were now virtually non-existent. He had decided he would rule the kingdom for himself. But the reality was far from his ambitions. The only battles he would fight from now on were against his own failing body. That February, the king's youngest brother, and Henri of Navarre, made an ill-fated and desperate attempt to escape from court where they were under constant surveillance. Their plan had been to flee to the Netherlands, and it failed almost before it began. Condé, however, at the same time, managed to escape to Germany. Since the beginning of May 1574, Charles had grown steadily weaker. By the middle of the month, it was clear that the end was near. Knowing that her son might die at any moment, Catherine had to ensure that she could protect the empty throne upon the arrival of Henri of Poland now. A formal document was drawn up on the king's orders, declaring his mother's regency until the return of the new king. Navarre and the Duke of Alcanon, her youngest son, witnessed the document, and when its contests were announced, Catherine ordered that it should be stated that it had been drawn up at their request, which was as untrue as it was unlikely. But her legal position now secure, Catherine remained with her dying son, who was not yet 24 years old. He had become pathetically thin, and she held his body in her arms as she tried to comfort him. He had made an earlier confession and then taken some light nourishment. As he did so, he, quote, cried over the sins he had committed out of weakness, which were the true cause of God's anger towards him and his people. In the early afternoon of May the 30th, 1574, an incident allegedly occurred, which is in several accounts of the king's death, but it's frankly hard to verify. Allegedly, Charles asked for his brother, although Alcanon was in the room. Catherine reassured him that he was right there. But accordingly, Charles said, quote, "No, madame, my brother, the King of Navarre." Henry duly arrived at Charles's bedside, who gave him a weak but affectionate embrace, and then said to him, quote, "You are losing a good friend, brother. If I had believed all I was told, you would not be alive. Do not trust." And then he trailed off, Catherine interjecting, quote, "Do not say it, sir." To which Charles, again, this is all allegedly, replied, "I do say it, madame. It is the truth." But then he ultimately revealed nothing, only commending his baby child to Navarre to be watched over. Finally, mercifully, Charles died late in the afternoon. He had been king since he was 10. Sadly, for all that he might have done, Charles IX is remembered to us today for St. Bartholomew's, an event he did not plan and agreed to only after the fact. In England, news of Charles's final demise was met with concern. No one knew what kind of king Anjou would become. There was enough concern, however, that he would end religious toleration in France, which would make maintaining an alliance with the French less appealing from the English standpoint. As a result, England moved closer to Spain in foreign relations. Now, I do not mean that England swapped France for Spain as an ally. Spain was, after all, not religiously tolerant, not in the least. Still, in August of 1574, England and Spain did sign a cautious peace treaty, somewhat normalizing relations. Keeping Mary Stuart around made it difficult for Spain and England to become allies, since she was a constant reminder of Spanish efforts to remove Elizabeth from power. Just that past April, Elizabeth had sent English troops to Edinburgh, where Mary's supporters had tried to take control of the royal castle. Elizabeth tried to persuade the Scottish regent again to take Mary back to Scotland, where she might be tried once more for her former husband's murder. But he realized that would only bring trouble, and he refused. For now, at least, Elizabeth was stuck with her cousin. By now, Scotland having abandoned her, Mary's sole ambition was to ascend the throne of England. She saw herself as a champion of the Catholic faith, overthrowing the heretic Elizabeth and restoring the true religion. It had become a mission of her life, a crusade she would pursue to death. She had no scruples at all about what she was doing, and little grasp, frankly, of reality. She once declared, quote, "I will not leave my prison save as Queen of England." Later events would prove that she meant it. While Shrewsbury was an effective guardian of Mary, the Scottish Queen still managed to keep up a steady stream of clandestine correspondence with the Pope, Philip II, and other Catholic monarchs. By now, I suppose she had become quite the prison veteran. Mary had been incarcerated in some way, shape, or form for about 6 years. She was only 32. There were still people, of course, pulling for Mary, but mostly these were people outside the British Isles, or in some cases, external actors who came to England. From 1574 onward, groups of clandestine Jesuit priests began arriving in England. They had one goal: to work for the restoration of the old faith. Many came from France, where they had been especially trained to work in England, doing all they could to restore Catholicism. And as we will see, they adopted very much a by any means necessary approach to their work. While some of these priests were merely present to administer to the remaining English Catholics, the government, the English government that is, never distinguished between them and the more militant type. Both were treated as traitors. By 1580, there would be hundreds of these Jesuit priests in England. These became involved in what was termed the quote-unquote enterprise of England, which was code for the theory that England could be made Catholic once more if a native insurgency supported an invasion from Spain. It wasn't remotely realistic, but Elizabeth's government still had to take it seriously. As a result of these factors, the activities of King Philip, the bull of excommunication, and the mere presence of Mary Stuart, even still as she moved into her 40s, Elizabeth could never feel secure on her throne. Next week, we will continue to follow England and France as they navigate the religious and political uncertainty of early modern Europe.